The best way to find truth in any historical event is to get as close as you can to the words, to the thoughts, to the actions of those men and women who were there. And this evening, that is our goal, to come as close as we can through the words of African Americans who were there. Freedom's Journey, African American Voices of the Civil War. To begin the program, we are most fortunate indeed to have with us one of America's great literary personages, an accomplished author and playwright. Charles Fuller is a Philadelphian. We in Boston must grant him that he would come here to this town, to this chamber, to share with us his views and his thoughts on freedom's journey. He is, of course, the author of A Soldier's Play, produced in 1981, and in 1982, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He is a recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and the National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship in Playwriting. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Charles Fuller.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here and very pleased to meet all of you. I had a speech I was going to read, but I'm only going to read part of it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about freedom's journey. What I'm going to read to you is the foreword which I wrote for the book. I had intended to expand that foreword to about 10 or 11 pages and read that to you, but you seem kind of a lively crowd, and we can talk about why I'm so excited about Mr. Yakovon's book, Freedom's Journey. So I'll read this forward. The forward's very short. In fact, I think it's, 3 pages? Yeah, about 3 pages. And then we can talk about soldiers at war and why this kind of material is necessary in our great United States. Okay? Now, the foreword begins, "The Negro is the key of the situation, the pivot upon which the whole rebellion turns." These words of Frederick Douglass that begin the introduction to Donald Yakovon's excellent collection of Civil War and post-Civil War documents, Freedom's Journey, are at the heart of the material you are about to read. Unlike other texts that describe the road to war, its consequences and aftermath through the work of abolitionists, politicians, soldiers, slaveholders, slaves, freed men and women from various regions of the country, this is the first collection of material from the period whose entire focus is wholly devoted to the attitudes and voices of black people. The people, the pivot, as it were, at the center of these extraordinary events. As such, it represents not only a unique opportunity to explore the feelings of the people for whom the war was fought, but it also resurrects their involvement in the war and allows us a clearer picture of the democratic ideals that precipitated it. Ideals that have, I am sorry to say, been lost in many instances through the historical recoloring of the events to reflect not the fight against the horror of slavery, but some idealized nonsense about Southern chivalry and the lost cause. Too often we are eased into forgetting that the Southern states of the Confederacy were in rebellion against the lawful authority of the United States. that they hoped through secession to retain the institution of slavery and hold in bondage 14 million African Americans against their will. At the root of all the myriad histories of the period surrounding the Civil War and its aftermath is this unassailable fact. Yet, as Donald Jacobone tells us in his introduction, blacks and whites, Northerners and Southerners, held and still hold entirely different views of the war, its meaning, and its residual effects. How is this possible? The major reasons are the extraordinary volume of history written about the Civil War and its aftermath, the color of its content, and who wrote it. However, there's another factor, less obvious. An example is Edward King's book, The Great South. Originally published as a series of articles by Scribner during 1873 and 1874, and described by its editors as presenting a remarkably sensitive and vivid picture of the American South in an important period of its history, as well as a work that encouraged sectional reconciliation. One is struck by the contrasting images of whites and Negroes. King, a Northeastern reporter for the New York Times, begins his first chapter with the words, "Louisiana today is paradise lost." Throughout his description of New Orleans and the South of his today, he gently juxtaposes energetic whites against lazy blacks, a faded South eager to retake its place in America against the more odious carpetbaggers who have arrayed the Negro wrongfully against the principal property holders. While not a history of the South or the war, it was the first widely read description of the post-war South and largely contributed, I believe, to the germ of the idea of a lost cause and a noble South who fought for honor and not to preserve slavery. The damage it did to Negroes in the North through stereotyping was incalculable. King encourages the soft, sweet South and a worthless, stupid Negro, unable to speak English and a drag on a region anxious to get started again. What is remarkable is that so many historians of the 19th and early 20th century downplay the effect popular articles like King's had on their own opinions about Reconstruction and the life it gave to their extrapolations of who and what the people of the South were before and during the war. The point I've tried to make above is that our differing racial views of the period may be as much the result of the Edward King's journalists sent into the South to report on its conditions as historians, whose work records events and the people who live them. Nowhere in the Great South is there a single instance of a Negro who could have, through education and learning, participated or initiated the events surrounding the war and its aftermath. So little that is intelligent is attributed to the Negroes that one wonders why the North expended so much energy and lives to free them. And while history books can describe battles and who won them, only the popular literature of the day can set the tone and color, the content of what most people will and want to believe. Freedom's journey is an extraordinary step forward in dispelling the idea of the black man as a humorous, lazy fool, recumbent in a cart with his eyes languidly closed and one dirty foot sprawled on the sidewalk. While I cannot argue that books like The Great South were the cause of our differing views of the Civil War and Reconstruction, I do believe long before anyone read a single history of these events, whole sections of the nation tuned in, as it were, to the monthly articles of King and other journalists like him. The die had been cast. The results continue in many ways, even now, and Freedom's Journey is one of the books that helps to bring balance and intelligence to a greatly misunderstood period. Okay? That's the 3 pages that are the forward for the book. I was going to read all this, but I changed my mind. What I want to talk to you about, though, is exactly that. I'm a playwright. I also write motion pictures. And one of the things that I wanted to do when I began writing, and this was when I was about 14 years old in a Catholic high school in Philadelphia called Roman Catholic High School. Me and my buddy wanted to be writers. And the reason we wanted to write was first because there were no black books in the library in that Catholic school. Not a single book written by a black person was in the library at Roman Catholic High School when I was 14 years old. Now that's 5,000 years ago for all of you. When I was 14, dirt was being made, okay? But at any rate, we wanted to write books. And we wanted to write books about ourselves. And the kind of material that we had to read when I was in high school were the history books that had come out during that period about slavery. And when the slavery books came out, Larry and I would kind of slide back in our seats, so that we couldn't be seen in the room. Because all of the material that was given to us in our high school in the history classes about the United States, certainly about slavery in that period of Reconstruction and the Civil War, talked about black people as though we were animals, as though we were the craziest, wildest, nutty, most violent, incorrigible people on earth. And if no more than to change some of those images, we wanted to be writers. And as I aged and struggled to be a writer and struggled to work and asked my wife to work while I was writing, and she looked at me like I was nuts, all of my intensity was to create work in which, when you saw it, and it was about black people were describing who we are and what we are. I had read all the books I could read in the English language, literature, novels, plays. When I was in the Army, I was the guy that got the books from the USO. And because I was interested in writing, I would give all the joke books, crossword puzzle books, cartoon books to all the rest of the soldiers in my platoon, and I would read all the classics. So for 3.5 to 4 years, I spent all my time, because I was stationed in Japan and Korea, reading books, because the Japanese and the Koreans did all the work. So I had 8 hours a day, every single day, where I could read a novel, which I did every single day. I had walked out of college because I didn't think I was learning anything. But what I learned as a consequence of reading all these books was first how to write, because I wanted to be a writer. And I knew that you couldn't be a writer unless you learned how to do that. And the only way to do that was to read the best writers in the world. But what I found out about black people during that period of time was that I never read a description of us that I thought made us proud. All the descriptions I read were that if we were good black people, we were subservient to white people. We were the good servant, the good butler, the person that the white people could trust, the one that turned in all their friends at the time of rebellion because they didn't want to see their white master hacked to death. But never did we have a life, never did we have a voice, and never did we, on our own, think about the kinds of things we wanted to do to change this country, to make it better, to fight against it, to struggle against all the things that we felt were evil in it. I didn't read that. When I got out of the Army, I had the good fortune of meeting Ralph Ellison and writers in New York who had been doing that, but there hadn't been much of their material around. And so I decided that what I would do as a writer was to do exactly what Mr. Jacobin has had the brilliance to decide to do, and that is to find the material that talked about my people as human beings, as people who fought, who struggled, who worked hard, who made it their business to fight and force this country to be what it had to be, the democracy for everyone in it. And why I was interested in doing the foreword for this book is precisely that. It goes along with the kind of thing that I've always done. That is, talk about us as human beings, not as ideas or stereotypes, not as a joking person or a tap dancer or someone that you can give a high five to all the time and that's all they want to do, but to talk about us as human beings who love, who feel things, who raise our children, who struggle, who fight to be good Americans in this society. And Mr. Yakoven's book addresses the kinds of issues that black people were dealing with before, during, and after the Civil War. In those pages that I read of his, it's an enormous book, by the way. It took me quite a while to read it, by the way. I'll just tell you that. I struggled to read it. It's quite a book. But I was delighted to read it because on every page, there are letters from soldiers. There are descriptions of the war from black women who followed their husbands and their lovers in the war. There are petitions sent to the government to change our lives. There are stories about soldiers who refused their pay because the government wouldn't pay them enough. And in all this material, you find human beings, not stereotypes, not people who are looking for someone to direct them, or people who are waiting for someone to do something for them, but people who take the initiative to make this country what it ought to be. And I can think of no better reason than that for writing the foreword. And no better reason than that to certainly recommend the book to all of you. Please read the book. Please look at this material. This material has been lost for a long time or not seen at all, a lot of it. We need to know these things about ourselves. We need to have a sense of what all the people in this country had an opportunity to do and what so many of us took that opportunity and used it. Not only for our own advantage, but for the advantage of this entire country. So I give you this book. I hope that you enjoy it. It is a wonderful, wonderful collection of material that Mr. Yakoven has put together, and I recommend it highly. And I'm glad that I didn't have to read this speech to you, because it would have put you to sleep. I'm not kidding you. You'd been sacked out by now. So I'm going to leave at this point. But thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening to me. Okay? Take care.
Voices from the distant past can only be heard through documents. No documents, no history. But yet all the documents of the past, combined and filled in archives and libraries throughout the world, are mute. Documents don't speak for themselves. Documents are reflective of life, but they're not life itself. It requires an historian, an editor, a writer, to delve into an archives and to bring that archives to life, to give it meaning, to give it context, in fact, to give it life. That is what good historians and good editors do. They take those mute documents and they give them life. Donald Yakoven is one of those people. He is, I'm very pleased to say, my colleague, senior associate editor at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and he, of course, is the person to whom we should be always grateful, who has collected, published, and given these documents life. Mr. Iacovone.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I didn't write out a speech. Don't worry. I want to thank Old South, my boss, Bill Fowler, the Boston National Historical Park, especially Marty Blatt, who's I notice is sitting over there, the Du Bois Institute, and my publisher, Lawrence Hill Books. I wasn't going to say this, but I think given what's been said tonight, I want to spend just a few seconds on the fact that it's sort of a big book, and it's not one that many presses would have done. And that tells us something about what's going on in the culture today. In fact, I think I would bet my advance on this fact that there isn't a university press in the country that would have published it. It's amazing to me when they asked me a couple of years ago to do this, that the only other book like this one was published in the 1960s. I think a large portion of the audience here wasn't born then. And even that book was an abridged version. The documents that book presented were all abridged. What is unique about this one is that each document is whole and complete as the author wrote it and intended. And it also does something else that no other similar collection does, and that includes women. That wasn't out of some bizarre PC desire. It was because this is a book about an era and the people in it and what they did. The Civil War was not just on the battlefield. It was in the cotton fields. It was in northern cities. It was in the camps of refugees, refugee slaves. It was in the cities in the north, and it was in the minds and hearts of those who sought freedom. It included everyone. So in Freedom's Journey, we find all the issues that mattered to African Americans and in their own voice. We must remind ourselves that in 1860, the year before the war began, there was no freedom in the United States. Sounds a bit shocking. But there was no freedom. There certainly was no freedom in the South. And even in the cradle of liberty here in Boston, as you'll find if you read the book, John Rock tells us there was no freedom here. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court issued the law of the land. Black men have no rights that white men are bound to respect. That is the world they lived in. That is the world that African Americans lived in. No one needed respect their rights. They couldn't move where they wanted to. They certainly couldn't vote in most states. And we sometimes forget that even in Abraham Lincoln's Illinois, they abrogated the Emancipation Proclamation. There was no freedom. The Democratic Party was the party of the slavocrats. The Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, offered what to African Americans? They offered to protect slavery where it existed. They offered to enforce the fugitive slave law. They offered colonization to African Americans. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln told a delegation of African Americans that blacks and whites could not live together in freedom. You must leave. That is the world that African Americans faced prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. They were not wanted. The Emancipation Proclamation was wrung from a North unwillingly. We must remember that. While the war turned into a revolution for freedom, it certainly did not begin that way. And Lincoln was clear in telling the nation that if he could have done it otherwise, he would not have issued the Emancipation Proclamation. African Americans had no friends in the United States. There was no freedom in the United States. But the Emancipation Proclamation was an opening, an opportunity. It forced the North to adopt freedom. It compelled them. And for African Americans, they understood its limitations. They understood that it freed no one in the South. It was the Union Army that must liberate them. But they understood the opportunity. Let me read you very briefly the words of Robert Hamilton, the great editor of the New York Weekly Anglo-African, someone you probably have never heard of, but who was undoubtedly one of the best editors, black or white, in the North. When, in January of 1863, he said of the Emancipation Proclamation and the world that it now created, "It is a fight for freedom, and we are bound to go in. Let us organize one regiment in every large northern city and send our offer of services directly to the President or the Secretary of War. We have been pronounced citizens by the highest legal authority. Why should we not share in the perils of citizenship? What better field to claim our rights than the field of battle? Where will prejudice be so speedily overcome? Where will brotherhood be so quickly and firmly cemented? It is now or never. Now, if ever." This guy could write. Well, you know how the war went. And in the early days of Reconstruction, up until about 1870, freedom was at its high tide. The Reconstruction constitutional amendments abolished slavery and gave rights to African Americans who never had them. But it is as if some evil universal force grabbed hold of the tide from the beach and drew it back. Freedom began to slip away. The more time passed, the less there was. Lynching replaced voting. And we descended into repression, Jim Crow, and lynching. It was an era in which the terrorists ran the country. The terrorists ran the country. The last third of this book is devoted to the way African Americans remembered the war. It is their recollections, their memoirs. What is memory? What is a society we choose to remember defines who we are and who we will be. And they participated in that process. For African Americans are a kind of litmus test. The way they lived in this country, the treatment they received, is a litmus test of the status or the health of democracy. This Civil War was not a brothers' war. People love to talk about a brothers' war. This was a war about freedom. And African Americans helped give us this. They are our founding fathers and mothers as much as Washington or Jefferson, and don't ever forget it. About 75 years ago, a popular historian said that, well, the fighting in the Civil War ended in 1865, but the political war over the Civil War will end about the year 3000. He may have been 1,000 years off. I think in some way, if there's always an America, there will always be a battle over the meaning of the Civil War. Immediately after the war, when authors began, or rather soldiers began to write their memoirs in the 1870s and 1880s, new generations were growing up, authors tried to craft a public memory of what the war meant. And that meaning was changing. Who was dominating the public sphere but Southern writers and their allies in the North? Suddenly a war that gave the nation freedom suddenly got changed. It was a lament over the loss of a golden age, this golden age of slavery where everyone knew their place and we knew who was in what place. The battle raged, and African Americans tried to maintain a place in that battle, and I've selected a portion of what they said for you. This battle continues to this day. We often think that, rightly, that the war was about slavery or had something to do with slavery. Yet there are authors today who are trying to revisit this history and recraft it. Now, the computer's a wonderful thing. In the web, you can find out all kinds of stuff. New book titles: The Myths of American Slavery, The South Was Right, The Real Lincoln, A New Look at Abraham Lincoln, His Agenda, and an Unnecessary War. Was Jefferson Davis right? A Constitutional History of Secession. Well, one reader of some of these books said, all of these books prove one thing. The South and Jefferson Davis were fighting for the Constitution. The South and Jefferson Davis were fighting for the Constitution, states' rights, and self-determination. Go to the website of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. The Sons of Confederate Veterans? I don't know. Okay. What do they say? The citizen soldiers who fought for the Confederacy personified the best qualities of America. The preservation of liberty and freedom was the motivating factor in the South's decision to fight the Second American Revolution. The tenacity with which Confederate soldiers fought underscored their belief in the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, the one they tried to destroy. Today, the Sons of Confederate Veterans is preserving the history and legacy of these heroes so future generations can understand the motives that animated the Southern cause. Go to the Dixie Daily News. It proclaims itself to be, quote, a Southern conservative, limited government, and free market viewpoint. It is, in fact, a secessionist newspaper. It is urging all true Christians, of whatever color they say, of whatever color, to move to South Carolina and vote secession. I'm not talking about 1861. I am talking about today. There are opinions, coursing through the web. Abraham Lincoln was reading Das Kapital, given to him by Charles Sumner. If he could abrogate, this is a quote, if he could abrogate the Constitution with the Emancipation Proclamation, then, quote, what keeps the next president from issuing the Enslavement Proclamation. What's the real motive here? If there is to be a future for white European Christians on this continent, the website says, and that's very much in doubt, it will only be because these groups preserve the memories of what we were. What facts are they giving? According to some websites, there were 65,000 black rebel soldiers. We're not erasing African Americans, as was done in the 19th century, from the story. We're reinventing the story. And astonishingly, if you didn't know it, you will now, there were 180,000 black Southerners just from Virginia who provided logistical support for the Confederate military. That's a great euphemism. But Abraham Lincoln is their real target. He's the stand-in for the federal government, which they wish to weaken. He is a vicious hypocrite, a scheming politician, and he led the invasion of the South. He was, in the words of one neo-Confederate, quote, America's worst president and probably our only real presidential war criminal. Now, back in 1928, a very popular historian wrote a book called Meet General Grant. He typified what was the state of historical and popular knowledge of the African American role in the Civil War. He said, the American Negroes are the only people in the history of the world, so far as I know, that ever became free without any effort of their own. The war that freed them was a war against their masters. Their freedom came as an incident of that conflict. They twanged banjos around the railroad stations, sang melodious spirituals, and believed that some Yankee would soon come along and give each of them 40 acres of land and a mule. That was the state of historical scholarship in the 1920s. The quotes I read you earlier represent what's currently going on in our culture about our understanding of the black role in the war and the meaning of the war. Whose words do we want in our ears? These Confederates or the people who made the history? Whose words do we want in our children's ears? Thank you all very much for coming tonight.
Thank you, Donald. Words read have power. Words heard can have even greater power. And this evening, the organizers of this meeting have assembled an extraordinary group of young people who are going to let us hear those words. They are directed by Mary Novotny Jones, who is a performance artist, teacher, and activist, a recipient of the 2000 Tanner Foundation Artist Award. Mary is on the faculty of the Museum of Fine Arts, and she is the lead artist educator at City Stage Company. Working with Mary are a group of very talented young people. Eric Casacillo, Michael Obasian, Jennifer Pascal, Randy Peace, Shakir Thrace. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let us...
Mr. Chairman.
Sir, the chair recognizes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honored guests, many of you know me. I was sold into slavery 8 different times. Now, many of you believe that slaves live in comfort. We have all we need from our masters. I'll tell you what is fact. A white man says a Negro was content. Well, I am a Negro, and I was not contented. A white man was not in slavery. I was. So I know where the shoe pinched. And I was not contented.
Content. I was not content. We were not content. I was not content. We were not content. I was not content. We was not content. I was not content. We was not content. I was not content. We was not content. I was not content. We were 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 not content. I was not content.
I was once on a plantation, and there were a lot of Negroes gathered by the side of the water. In the middle was a stalwart Negro with an axe on his shoulder. The overseer urged the Negroes find a thing to make them come out. But all the boys know. They all knew to do it. It was not approaching. The overseer sent for the young master, who came down and said,
Jim, you must come out of the water!
I'll come out if you promise not to flog me. I did nothing to be fought for. I did my work faithfully. You sold my wife away.
The young master appealed to him by all the feelings connected by their boyhood. Finally, the young master said to the Negro driver,
You must shoot him down.
the Negro driver raised his rifle, and with a sharp crack of the rifle, sent the 4th horse flowing down the stream. The blood stained in the water. Now that I saw. It wasn't that the person who did it was more bloodthirsty, or tyrannical, or ferocious, or more cruel than many of us might be here. If the Negro would have been successful in defying his authority that day, another Negro would have tried the next, and so on, until discipline would have been an end at the plantation. If one Negro is successful, another Negro is successful. But if one is shot down, the others are deterred. The institution of slavery is so bitter that it sours everything it comes in contact with. I know I was a slave until I was 22 years of age, and I know I suffered. Because I was associated with gentlemen who were so near to liberty and brought me so near to it that I wanted it all the more.
Reverend Martin, who was self-taught, was minister to Boston's Joy Street Church when the war broke out in 1861. The excerpt you just heard from his passionate speech in Bristol, England, October 27, 1865, stirred audience because of the authority of his personal experience.
A favorite maxim among slaveholders is that revolutions never go backwards. This weapon is two-edged. It cuts both ways. If revolutions never go backwards, then they are as likely to move forward in one direction as in the other, in the North and in the South. One most important element of this war on the part of the North is to teach the South a lesson it has been slow to learn. The first of these lessons is to demonstrate before all, especially people in the South, that they've been entirely and most dangerously deceived. These slave-holding rebels tell us to our teeth that they do not love us.
All of our past efforts to make them love us have proved abortive.
That will prove so in the future.
Now the next best thing, if we cannot make them love us,
It's to make them fear us.
What I've said applies with even more force to the man of sable hue. If this conflict shall expand to the grand dimension in which events seem to indicate, the iron arm of the black man may be called into service.
Our next speaker is Nina Silber, Associate Professor at Boston University, where she specializes in the period of the American Civil War. She is the author of the 2003 book, Landmarks of the Civil War, as well as numerous other publications about that epoch. She is now completing a book dealing with Northern women in the Civil War. Professor Silber.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to be part of this exciting evening and to celebrate this wonderful book, Freedom's Journey. I also want to talk about a theme that people have addressed and the performers have addressed and the book addresses, which is the subject of memory and the subject of how we remember the Civil War today, what this book helps us remember about the Civil War, and how we need to remember certain parts of the Civil War that have not been remembered, how we need to put at the forefront certain memories that are troubling, certain memories that are unpleasant. But if we don't grapple with those memories today, I think it says something about where we stand as a nation today and our willingness to confront certain injustices that still exist. So I think it's a testament to our ability to deal with those injustices if we can remember the Civil War, including some of its difficult and troubling aspects. What I want to talk about specifically is how the Civil War is remembered at places, at historic sites, at places that we visit, like Civil War battlefields, various historic sites that remember the Civil War, that harken back to the Civil War, and how, especially the subject of slavery, is being treated at these Civil War battlefield sites, and also how it hasn't been treated at some of these Civil War battlefield sites. So I guess for some of you, if you've been to a place like Gettysburg, or if you've been to a Civil War battlefield, or might possibly go to a Civil War battlefield, it's helpful to think about what you see there, what you don't see there, what you might expect to see there in the future. Let me say first, it's helpful to have a little bit of history about Civil War battlefields. Some people think there's actually there's a book called Confederates in the Attic, and it's a different book, really a different kind of book about memory, in which the author travels through the South and he talks to different people about how they remember the Civil War and why certain Southerners continue to be obsessed about the Civil War. And he tells this story, actually, at one point he goes to visit Fort Sumter, National Historic Site, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. And he's talking to the park ranger at Fort Sumter. And the park ranger tells him this anecdote, and he says one time he was leading a tour group through Fort Sumter, and he was stumped by one of the questions that one of the tourists asked, and the question that the visitor asked was this. He said, "Why were so many Civil War battles fought on national parks?" Now, I'm not going to try and answer that question because that would be a little bit difficult, but it does suggest that going to those battlefields is often the first viewpoint many people get of the Civil War. And there's a way in which that image of what you see at the battlefield is often one of the most important ways that we get our history. And that these battlefield sites have been a very important way in terms of how the public has been educated, what they learn about the Civil War. And I want to talk somewhat more about those battlefield sites and about how they have and have not addressed the history of slavery. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of those sites, something about how and when those historic sites, those battlefield sites specifically, came to be specially preserved locations. So basically what you see today, if you went to some place like Gettysburg or if you went to Antietam or Shiloh or some of these famous Civil War battle sites, they came out of the late 19th century. Well, there were really battles fought there, but in the late 19th century, there was a movement underfoot to preserve those sites. And veterans were involved, historians were involved, preservationists were involved, and they wanted to see that land be preserved as a place where the battles could be remembered and the dead from those battles could be memorialized. At the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the federal government became involved. They began assuming control of this. You know, the National Park Service is created. They established these special sites to remember the Civil War. It's important, though, to note one very important point. When these battlefield sites were first being preserved and memorialized, it was done very much in a spirit of reconciliation. In other words, it was done by veterans, a lot of actual veterans from the war, from the North and from the South, but mostly white veterans from the North and the South, who thought that celebrating the battlefield and remembering the battlefield would be an important way to forget the politics. Let's forget about what divided us. Let's forget about the differences that split the country apart. And instead, let's go to these battlefields so we could remember the common bravery and the common heroism of soldiers from both sides of the conflict. Right? So this happens at Gettysburg, and they put up statues to Northern soldiers, to Southern soldiers. They don't really put up many statues to African Americans. They don't really remember much about slavery. And that's the point. This spirit of reconciliation had a certain appeal, but what it also meant was that the big political questions were ignored, especially the kinds of political questions that pointed to the differences between the North and the South. Those kinds of differences were being consciously avoided. So, in other words, people were not going to talk about slavery. They were going to avoid the discussion of slavery. And if you went to those historic sites, you would learn nothing about slavery. And this, I think, was in keeping with the way most people from the end of the 19th century up until probably the 1960s thought about the Civil War. Slavery was incidental. There were other questions. There was honor. There was states' rights. There was constitutional issues. Slavery was not important. Let's forget about it. That was an unpleasant thing that we don't like to talk about. In the last 10 years, I would say there has been a new impulse, and you can see it at a lot of these historic sites, to show how slavery was central to the story of the Civil War. And to some extent, this has happened as a sort of delayed reaction. A delayed reaction to new scholarship on the Civil War, scholarship that says, yes, slavery really was central to the reason why the war began. And it also happened, I think, because there's been a willingness in the National Park Service, in other historic sites, to tell not just celebratory stories about American history, but more troubling histories as well. So it's part of the same impulse that says, let's talk about the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War at a place like Manzanar. Or let's talk about the destruction of Native American life and culture at the Trail of Tears or at the Sand Creek Massacre site in Colorado. And also, as I mentioned, I think these sites have also taken a cue from historians and changes in historical scholarship. And so in this regard, I can say that most historians now who study the Civil War would now tell you point blank that one of the central, if not the foremost cause of the Civil War was slavery. And I think most historians now, any Civil War historian worth their salt or whatever, would tell you that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War. And let me clarify, as one of those historians who would tell you that, let me clarify what this means. It does not mean that most historians think that slavery was the main reason why individuals went to fight. So we wouldn't say that every individual who went off to fight, whether they were from the North or were from the South, that slavery was the main individual motivation for each person who fought in the war. There was a wide variety of individual responses to the war. But nonetheless, the most important underlying reason for the formation of the Confederacy, the most important underlying reason for the secession of the South from the Union, was the need and the desire of Southern leaders to protect the institution of slavery. And that, I think, would go without question. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new Confederate government rested, quote, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and normal condition. Edmund Ruffin from Virginia, 2 days before Lincoln's election, wrote that this election would, quote, show whether the institution of Negro slavery on which the social and political existence of the South rests is to be secured by our resistance or to be abolished in a short time as the certain result of our present submission to Northern domination. So Southerners at the time were very clear on this. This was a war about slavery. Historians down the road were less clear, and we're trying to forget that. So, returning to the question then of how this theme is being developed and approached at historic sites, especially at Civil War battlefield sites, I would say there, my impression is that historians at these sites have been very conscious of making the same kind of distinction that I just made to you. In other words, what people are very clear about saying is that slavery did represent an underlying political issue that caused the country to separate, but it was not necessarily the main factor that determined why individuals chose to fight. So along these lines, new exhibits have been developed or are in the process of being developed, and all of them begin by trying to place the war in a broader context, by explaining how and why some Americans became invested in a particular way of life that included slavery, why others did not, and how those fundamental differences set the stage for war. So, for example, at Fort Sumter, if you visited Fort Sumter, you would find a series of sections that cover the broad questions involving the U.S. Constitution, the social and economic conditions in early 19th century America. They would then focus on the specific role of South Carolina, where slavery had been so important, and look at the role of South Carolina in leading the secession movement out of the Union. A similar process is underway at Gettysburg. But in Gettysburg, of course, you have the more interesting and you have a sort of challenging problem because Gettysburg, after all, is the main Civil War battlefield site that stands outside the South. There was not slavery there in Gettysburg. But there, the exhibits at Gettysburg will largely focus on themes and ideas highlighted in the Gettysburg Address, and will focus especially on the theme of how the battle at Gettysburg, to use Abraham Lincoln's words, represented a new birth of freedom. So there are not specific exhibits there on slavery, but in Gettysburg, what you can talk about is free blacks and the experience of free blacks during the Civil War, and in fact, the very real threat that free African Americans experienced when the Confederates invaded Pennsylvania. When Confederates invaded Pennsylvania, one of the first things they did was identify free blacks and capture them and send them south into slavery. So people who were free and had been free for generations experienced the terror of the Confederate invasion in very real and tangible ways. A woman, for example, who was living in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, explained how she saw a number of black women and children who she knew from her town, free women and children in her town who had been living there, who were now, quote, driven by just like we would drive cattle when the Confederate troops descended. So that people who were free could experience this kind of threat from the Confederacy. And then in a few cases, there are Civil War sites who try to tell the story, not just the story of slavery as a big political issue, or slavery as an institution in a place where a particular battle occurred, but also the story of how slavery during the Civil War gradually came to an end. So, for example, if you were to visit the battlefield at Shiloh and then just outside the battlefield in Corinth, Mississippi, you would find an exhibit on the contraband camps, or what were called the contraband camps. The contraband camps were places where black men and women came after escaping from slave plantations during the war, and they would run to the lines of the Union Army, knowing that this was a place where they could seek refuge from plantation owners and where they had the hope of securing their freedom. But the contraband camps often were places that were overpopulated, poorly sanitized, places that bred filth and disease. And so they tell us certainly something about the problem of freedom as it was experienced by African Americans during the Civil War. It tells them something about the miserable conditions that slaves encountered even from Union Army forces during the war. But they also were places where new free labor experiments were tried out, where men and women were contracted to work for the government in exchange for wages, where some even minimal progress was being made away from the institution of slavery, not always clear towards what else, but at least a break from slavery and towards some new kind of arrangement. And so, in short, those camps, I think, tell us something about how the war was closely involved with the institution of slavery. They tell us something about how the war destroyed the institution of slavery. But they also tell us something about how the war, in the end, failed to deliver any kind of thorough equality for African Americans. And so from the contraband camps to the fields of Gettysburg to the barracks of Fort Sumter, I think Americans slowly can begin to get a clearer picture of how slavery shaped so much of this central drama in American history. And they can begin also to get a sense of the legacy that that struggle has bequeathed to us today. Thank you.
Action! Action is the plain duty of this hour. There's no time to delay. From east to west, north to south, the sky is written all over, now or never. Massachusetts now welcomes you into arms as soldiers. Go quickly and fill up the 1st Colored Regiment of the North. I am authorized to tell you, you will receive the same wages, the same rations, the same treatment, and the same bounty secured to white soldiers. The iron gates of our prison stand half open. One gallant rush from the north will fling it open. This is our golden opportunity.
Our understanding understanding of an event like the Civil War is made more immediate through personal accounts. We are fortunate to have some letters from African Americans from both the North and South.
Dear wife, I'm enlisted in the Army. I'm in the state of Massachusetts. Gray is the colored people rallying with the hearts of lions against the sand curse that separated you and I. But yet we'll meet again someday. And little Jacob, I want to see him, but I know it's impossible. Say no more. Yours truly, your affectionate husband. Samuel Jenkins, 1862.
Northside, South Carolina, July 20, 1863. Dear mother and father, I cannot ride the floor, expecting every moment to be called into another fight. Saturday night, we make our most desperate charge of the war in Fort Wagner, losing and killed, wounded and missing, 300 of our men. The splendid 54th cuts to pieces. If I had another opportunity, I would write more fully. But if I die tonight, I will not die a coward. Goodbye.
Lewis Henry Douglas, son of Frederick Douglas, stood on the parapet of Fort Wagner along with Robert Gold Sharp. Douglas was the highest ranking enlisted man in his unit. He survived the South and the North. Like his father, he defended black rights and reforms after the war.
Susie King Taylor was only 14 when she joined the Union Army. She was the laundress. This story is the only story that we have of a black woman in the Civil War.
I have learned to use a musket. I can shoot straight. I mean it. I can shoot straight. And I won't miss. I even know how to use a gun. I can take it apart and put it back together. And the boys will say to me,
Miss Taylor, why is it you are so kind to us? You treat us as you treat your own boys in your own company.
well, you know, you guys do the same to me. Why should I treat you any different?
No one wrote more of these issues of justice than Sergeant George E. Stevens. In 1863, he left his Philadelphia home and joined the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. What you are about to hear is a Sergeant Stevens who is devastated of the prejudice toward African Americans in service to their country. Stevens asked, is there no justice in America?
Morris Island, South Carolina, October 3rd, 1863. Mr. Thomas Hamilton, you have heard, I suppose, of this matter of pay. It has caused a great deal of trouble, and if not adjusted, one of the best regiments that ever left Massachusetts will become utterly demoralized. There was an offer to pay us $10 per month, less 3 for clothing. It is insulting to us to pay us half the pay of a poor white private.
Sergeant, what's going on?
Sergeant, when are we going to get paid?
What about our pay?
To give you some feelings of our officers here regardless of this point, I will give you a short speech by Colonel James Montgomery, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Union Army.
You ought to be glad to pay for the privilege to fight instead of squabbling about money. You're fugitive slaves and can by law be returned to your masters. You are a race of slaves. Years ago, your fathers worshipped snakes and crocodiles in Africa. My advice to y'all is y'all ought to get rid of the bad blood. The lightest of you must marry the blackest woman. It's mutiny to refuse to take your pay, and mutiny is punishable with death.
We have not the slightest idea that he can contain such a spirit of hatred toward our people. You should be glad to pay for the privilege to fight. After we endured the slavery of 250 years, we should be glad to pay for the privilege to fight and die to enable the North and to conquer the South. What an idea!
The period of Reconstruction after the war brought many African Americans to the South. Many women blacks felt that it was not only a duty but a heroic mission to educate their people in the South. What they did not expect was an enormous difference in culture.
College was ambitious, traveled south to help us transition to freedom. In 1862, Grimke taught in a model reconstruction program in Fort Royal, South Carolina. The article in the Atlantic Monthly of 1864 gives us insight to the process of reconstruction and allows us to glance at the sea of ivory of black culture on the Eastern Seas.
On the Sunday before Thanksgiving, General Jackson's proclamation was read at church. We could not listen to it without emotion. The people listened with deepest attention and seemed to understand and appreciate it. Thanksgiving Day was observed as a national holiday, and ox had been killed on each plantation that people might like to have fresh meat, which was a great luxury to all of them. In the morning, a large number assembled in the church.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
It was a sight not soon to be forgotten.
Forever free.
Forever free. Those words of the proclamation were concentrating themselves in my soul.
Oh my Lord, jubilee in the morning. My Lord, jubilee in the evening. Oh my Lord, jubilee in the morning. My Lord, jubilee, jubilee. Oh my Lord, jubilee. My Lord, jubilee. Walking members walking. Oh my Lord, walking on your Jesus. My Lord, jubilee. Shout my children, God you're free. Oh my Lord, my God brought you liberty. My Lord, jubilee. Call me a Sunday Christian. Oh my Lord, call me a Monday devil. My Lord, jubilee. Don't care what you call me. Oh my Lord, so long Jesus love me. My Lord, jubilee. Jubilee, jubilee. Oh my Lord, jubilee, jubilee. My Lord, jubilee.
The tiniest children are delighted in the living hands. The parents of these have all learned. They're willing to make any sacrifices that their children may attend school. Daily, the long oppressed people of these islands are demonstrating capacity for learning and labor. Still, the sky is dark. But through the darkness, we can discern a brighter future.
We are the bright future.
We are today's community.
We have our ways of greeting each other.
We have our style and our music.
When you hear that beat, it should be track 3. A DJ usually sends a shout out to someone either through song or either through, hey, I would send a shout out to my husband or son.
So